Jake Hollister had spent 20 years avoiding other people's problems, but the child's scream echoing across the mountain made his blood run cold in a way that demanded action. What he found when he reached the source, a massive steel door embedded impossibly into the mountainside with a terrified little girl sitting in front of it, would destroy everything he thought he knew about the quiet valley he called home. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning Jake Hollister heard the screams, he had been riding the high country for 3 days straight, checking fence lines and searching for strays that had wandered too far from his ranch in the valley below. The November air was crisp enough to see his breath, and the pine forests that blanketed the mountainside were thick with fog that rolled through the trees like ghostly fingers reaching for something just beyond grasp. He was a man accustomed to solitude, finding more comfort in the company of his horse Red than in the crowded saloons and church socials that defined life in the town of Pinewood, 15 miles distant. At 42, Jake had lived enough years on the frontier to know that the mountains held secrets, some beautiful and others better left undisturbed. The sound came to him on the wind, faint at first, so subtle he almost dismissed it as the cry of an eagle or the howl of a distant wolf. But something about the pitch made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, made Red's ears swivel forward with nervous attention. It was human, unmistakably so, a scream that carried the kind of terror that transcended language and spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that understood danger without needing explanation. Jake pulled Red to a halt, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured in his saddle scabbard, and listened with the focused intensity of a man who had survived 20 years in country where inattention could mean death. The scream came again, clearer this time, originating from somewhere higher up the mountain, past the tree line where the terrain became brutal and unforgiving. It was the voice of a child, young enough that the sound carried a quality of pure, unfiltered fear that hit Jake somewhere deep in his chest. He had no children of his own, had never married despite the occasional efforts of well-meaning women in town who seemed to think a man his age needed saving from himself. But the sound of that child's terror did something to him, awakened a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed with such force. Without conscious thought, Jake urged Red forward, guiding the sturdy quarter horse up the increasingly steep trail that wound between massive ponderosa pines and rocky outcroppings. The fog was thicker here, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction, and the temperature had dropped noticeably as they climbed. Red picked his way carefully over loose rocks and exposed roots, trusting his rider's judgment even as the path became more treacherous. Jake leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes scanning the misty landscape for any sign of the source of those screams, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Mountain lions sometimes took children who wandered too far from homesteads. Bears, though rare this late in the season, were not unknown. There were cliffs and crevasses that could swallow a person whole, leaving nothing but echoes and grief. But something about this situation felt different, wrong in a way that had nothing to do with natural predators or geographical hazards. The scream had come from too high up the mountain, past where any sensible family would allow a child to wander. And there was something else, a quality to the sound that suggested not just fear of immediate danger, but a deeper horror, something that spoke of human cruelty rather than nature's indifference. The trail opened up suddenly into a clearing, and what Jake saw there made him pull Red to an abrupt halt, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene before him. Set into the mountainside, where nothing should exist but rock and dirt and ancient stone, was a door. Not a mine entrance, though Jake had seen plenty of those scattered throughout these mountains, remnants of the silver boom that had come and gone 20 years prior. This was something else entirely, a heavy metal door painted rust orange, secured with massive rivets and marked with a faded sign that read, "Danger," in bold red letters. It looked like something that belonged in a military installation or a government facility, utterly out of place in this remote wilderness. And sitting on the ground in front of that impossible door, small and terrified and impossibly alone, was a child. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, her dress torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and mud. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound that Jake felt his heart clench. She looked up at him as he dismounted, and he saw in her expression not relief at being found, but a desperate warning, as if his arrival had somehow made things worse rather than better. Jake approached slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice gentle. "Hey there, little one. My name's Jake. I'm not going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" The child's mouth opened, but before any words could emerge, another scream pierced the air. This one came from behind the metal door, muffled but unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, filled with such anguish that it seemed to physically impact the air around them. The little girl's face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying with it the promise of snow. "They took my mama." Jake looked from the terrified child to the ominous metal door set impossibly into the mountainside and felt the weight of a choice settling onto his shoulders. Every instinct screamed at him to gather the child, mount Red, and ride as fast as possible back to civilization, to let the territorial authorities handle whatever nightmare was unfolding behind that door. But the sound of that woman's scream echoed in his ears, mixing with the child's desperate whisper, and he knew with the certainty that sometimes comes in moments of crisis that there was no time for authorities, no time for careful planning or backup. Whatever was happening behind that metal door, whatever impossible evil had taken root in this remote mountainside, it was happening now. And a woman who was somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, was suffering behind that steel barrier while her child sat abandoned in the cold November morning. Jake Hollister had lived a quiet life, avoiding trouble and keeping to himself, content to work his small ranch and ask nothing of the world except to be left alone. But as he looked at that little girl's tear-stained face and heard another muffled scream from behind the impossible door, he realized that his quiet life had just come to an abrupt and irreversible end. Jake knelt beside the child, moving slowly as one would approach a frightened animal. Up close he could see she was shivering violently, her thin dress offering no protection against the mountain cold. His own sheepskin coat was too large for her small frame, but he removed it anyway and wrapped it around her shoulders, watching as she pulled it tight with trembling hands. The coat swallowed her completely, making her look even smaller and more vulnerable than she already was. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked again, keeping his voice soft despite the urgency pounding in his chest. Behind that door, the screaming had momentarily stopped, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. "Emma," she whispered, her eyes darting between Jake's face and the metal door as if expecting something terrible to emerge at any moment. "Emma Garrett. My mama is Sarah Garrett. We were picking berries, and the men came. They put bags over our heads and brought us here." Jake's mind raced, trying to make sense of what the child was telling him. The Garrett name was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Pinewood had perhaps 300 souls scattered across the valley and surrounding hills, and while Jake kept mostly to himself, he knew the major families. Sarah Garrett. The name tugged at his memory, something about a widow who had moved to the area within the past year, but he couldn't grasp the details. "How many men, Emma?" he asked, already running through the limited options available to him. His rifle held 6 rounds, and he had perhaps 24 more cartridges in his saddlebag. Against multiple armed men in an unknown structure, those were odds that didn't favor a lone cowboy, no matter how determined. Emma held up 4 small fingers, then seemed to reconsider, and added a 5th. 5, I think. maybe more inside. They wore masks, black ones that covered everything except their eyes. They talked about experiments and about how many more they needed. Her voice broke on the last word, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. One of them said they didn't need children, that I was a mistake. He was going to kill me, but another man said to just leave me outside, that the mountain would take care of it. The casual cruelty of that statement sent a cold fury washing through Jake. These men had planned to let exposure and predators do their dirty work, leaving a child alone on a mountain to die slowly rather than waste a bullet on her. Whatever was happening behind that door, whatever purpose drove these men, it had stripped them of anything resembling humanity. "How long have you been out here, Emma?" Jake asked, though he could already see from her bluish lips and the way her shivering had intensified that it had been too long. Hypothermia was setting in, and if he didn't get her warm soon, the rescue would become a recovery. "Since the sun came up," she replied, her words slightly slurred now. "Is it still morning?" "I can't tell anymore. Everything looks the same in the fog." Jake pulled his pocket watch from his vest. Just past 9 o'clock. If Emma had been out here since dawn, she had been exposed to temperatures below freezing for at least 2 hours, possibly longer. The November cold was deceptive, seeming mild during the day but capable of killing at night or in the early morning hours when the mountain retained its darkness. He looked at Red, standing patiently a few yards away, then back at the metal door. Every practical instinct told him to lift Emma onto his horse and ride for help. Pinewood had a doctor, old but competent, who could treat the child's exposure. The territorial marshal could be summoned from the county seat. A proper posse could be formed, armed men with experience in confronting dangerous situations. It was the smart choice, the sensible one. But another scream erupted from behind the door, this one weaker than before, fading into a sob that was somehow more terrible than the initial cries had been. It was the sound of hope dying, of a person realizing that no rescue was coming, that whatever horror they faced would be endured alone. And Jake knew in that moment that by the time he returned with help, Sarah Garrett would be dead or worse, and whatever evil operation these masked men were conducting would have vanished like smoke, leaving nothing but questions and grief. "Emma," he said, making a decision that went against every survival instinct he had developed over 2 decades in the wilderness. "I need you to do something very brave for me. Can you be brave?" The little girl nodded, though her eyes were glazed now, shock and cold stealing her focus. Jake moved quickly to Red, pulling a thick wool blanket from his bedroll and returning to wrap it around Emma over his coat. He lifted her small form, surprised at how light she was, and carried her to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock formation about 20 yards from the door. The location offered some protection from the wind and was hidden from direct view of anyone emerging from the structure. "I'm going to start a small fire here," he told her, already gathering the driest wood he could find and pulling matches from his pocket. "You're going to stay right here and keep warm. I'm going inside that door to get your mama. Do you understand?" Emma's small hand grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "They have guns," she whispered urgently. "Big ones. And they said something about guards. What if they kill you too?" Jake met her frightened eyes and saw in them the terrible knowledge that already she had seen too much, understood too much about the darkness humans were capable of inflicting on each other. "Then you wait until the fire goes out and you ride Red down the mountain. He knows the way home. You follow the trail downward, always downward, and you'll reach my ranch by afternoon. There's a woman there sometimes, Mrs. Chen, who brings me vegetables from her garden. She'll take care of you." It was a lie about Mrs. Chen being there. She only visited once a week, but Emma needed something to hold on to, some promise of safety beyond the immediate terror. The fire caught quickly despite the damp air, and Jake added enough wood to keep it burning for at least an hour. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard, checked the action, and turned toward the impossible door set into the mountainside. Before he could take a step, Emma's voice stopped him. "Mr. Jake, my mama is good. She reads to me every night and makes the best apple pie in the whole territory. Please bring her back." Jake looked at this child who was trying so hard to be brave, who had been left to die by men without conscience, and felt something harden in his chest. "I'll bring her back, Emma. I promise." It was a promise he had no guarantee of keeping, made to a child who deserved better than the cruelty the world had shown her. But as Jake approached that metal door with its faded danger warning, his rifle ready and his jaw set with determination, he knew he would die trying rather than break his word to a little girl who had already lost too much. The metal door was cold beneath Jake's palm as he tested it, expecting to find it locked or barred from within. To his surprise, it swung open with minimal resistance, the hinges well-oiled despite their remote location. The ease of entry troubled him more than resistance would have. These men were confident enough in their isolation that they hadn't bothered with locks, secure in the belief that no one would find this place or dare to enter if they did. Beyond the threshold lay darkness broken only by the faint glow of oil lamps somewhere deeper in the structure. The smell hit him immediately, a nauseating mixture of chemicals, unwashed bodies, and something else he couldn't identify, but that triggered a primal revulsion deep in his gut. The air itself felt wrong, thick and oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain cold he was leaving behind. Jake paused at the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom while listening for any indication of where the guards Emma had mentioned might be positioned. The passage before him had been carved directly into the mountain, the walls showing marks of pickaxes and drill bits, though the floor was surprisingly smooth, almost polished. This was no hastily abandoned mine shaft. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating this space, hollowing out the mountain for purposes that Jake suspected had nothing to do with mineral extraction. Electric lights lined the ceiling at regular intervals, though only every third one was lit, creating pools of shadow between islands of illumination. He had seen electric lighting only once before, during a brief visit to Denver 3 years prior, and the presence of such modern technology in this remote location added another layer of impossibility to the situation. Jake moved forward, his boots making no sound on the smooth stone floor. The rifle felt inadequate in his hands now, a frontier weapon confronting something that belonged to a different world entirely. The passage descended at a gentle angle, curving slightly to the right. After perhaps 50 feet, it opened into a larger chamber, and what Jake saw there made him press himself against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The space before him was a laboratory, though unlike any he could have imagined. Metal tables lined the walls, covered with glass beakers and tubing that connected various containers in configurations Jake couldn't begin to understand. Charts and diagrams covered one wall, displaying the human body in cross-section, with notations in handwriting too small and distant for him to read. But it was the center of the room that drew and held his horrified attention. 3 metal cages stood in a row, each roughly 6 feet square, and 2 of them contained people. The first held a man in his 30s, unconscious or possibly dead, slumped against the bars with his head hanging at an unnatural angle. The second cage imprisoned a woman, and even from his hiding spot, Jake could see the terror in her eyes as she watched 2 masked figures working at a table nearby. She was gagged, her hands bound, and even in the dim light, he could see bruises covering her exposed arms. Sarah Garrett. It had to be. The resemblance to little Emma was unmistakable in the shape of her face, the dark hair that fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. She was alive, conscious, and aware of his presence. Her eyes had found him in the shadows, widening with a mixture of hope and fear that made Jake's decision for him. There would be no waiting, no careful reconnaissance. Whatever was about to happen in this underground nightmare, it was going to happen now. The two masked men were bent over their work, speaking in low voices that didn't carry to Jake's position. He counted doorways leading from the chamber, 3 including the passage he had entered through, which meant potential reinforcements from at least 2 directions. The odds were impossible, but then again, everything about this situation defied possibility. A metal door in a mountainside, electric lights powered by sources unknown, a laboratory conducting experiments on kidnapped civilians. If impossibilities were the order of the day, perhaps one cowboy against multiple armed men was simply one more. Jake raised his rifle, sighting on the nearest masked figure. The distance was perhaps 30 feet, an easy shot under normal circumstances. But his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He had killed before, during the border conflicts with Mexico years ago, when he had been young and foolish enough to think violence solved problems. The memories of those deaths had haunted him through 2 decades of peaceful ranching, faces appearing in his dreams to remind him that taking a life, even in combat, left marks on the soul that never fully healed. But as he watched Sarah Garrett's terrified eyes tracking the movements of her captors, as he thought of little Emma shivering by a fire outside and waiting for a mother who might never return, Jake found his hands steadying. This was different from the confused brutality of border wars. This was as clear as moral choices ever became. Evil wearing masks and conducting experiments on helpless people in a hidden laboratory. Good represented by a cowboy who should have minded his own business but couldn't because some things demanded action, regardless of the cost. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off stone walls and metal equipment. The nearest masked figure spun and fell, his companion turning with a shout of alarm that died in his throat as Jake worked the lever action and fired again. The second shot was less precise, catching the man in the shoulder rather than center mass, but it was enough to send him staggering backward into one of the metal tables, sending glass beakers crashing to the floor. For a moment, the tableau held, Jake lowering his rifle to work the action again. Sarah Garrett frozen in her cage, her eyes wide with shock. The wounded man sliding down the overturned table, leaving a trail of blood on the white surface. Then chaos erupted from every direction at once. Boots thundered from the doorways Jake had noted earlier. Shouts echoed through the chambers, some calling for weapons, others demanding to know what was happening. Jake counted at least 4 distinct voices, possibly more, and knew with cold certainty that he had just started a fight. He had no realistic chance of winning. But he had also announced his presence, made it impossible for these men to simply continue their work as if nothing had changed. Whatever experiments they were conducting would now have to pause while they dealt with an intruder, and that interruption might be the only gift he could give to the people trapped in those cages. He sprinted toward Sarah's cage, fumbling with the lock while keeping his rifle pointed toward the nearest doorway. The mechanism was simple, a sliding bolt rather than a key lock, clearly designed for quick access rather than security. The cage door swung open and Sarah stumbled out, her bound hands making it difficult to maintain balance. Jake pulled the gag from her mouth while working at the ropes around her wrist with one hand, his other still gripping the rifle. "Can you walk?" he asked urgently, knowing they had perhaps seconds before the converging men reached this chamber. "Yes," Sarah gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "But there are others. More cages deeper inside. They took at least 6 people from the valley over the past month." The information hit Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't a single crime, but a sustained operation, an organized evil that had been preying on his neighbors while he worked his ranch in oblivious isolation. The scope of it was staggering, and the implications terrifying. How many had died already? How many more were marked for whatever nightmarish purposes drove these masked experimenters? But there was no time for reflection or planning. The first of the reinforcements burst through the eastern doorway, and Jake's rifle spoke again. The man who came through the doorway wore the same black mask as his fallen companions, but his movements carried a military precision that the others had lacked. He didn't simply charge into the room, but entered in a tactical crouch, a pistol already raised and tracking for targets. Jake's shot caught him in the chest, the impact spinning him sideways, but not before he managed to squeeze off a round that whined past Jake's ear close enough to feel the air displacement. Sarah had freed herself from the loosened ropes and was already moving toward the unconscious man in the first cage, checking for signs of life. "He's breathing," she called out, her voice steadier now despite the chaos erupting around them. "But barely. They've been drugging him, injecting something that makes them sleep." Jake backed toward her position, keeping his rifle trained on the doorways while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. They were trapped in a chamber with limited exits, facing an unknown number of armed enemies who knew the terrain intimately. His ammunition wouldn't last forever, and even if he could hold them off temporarily, eventually weight of numbers would tell. But surrender wasn't an option, not when it meant returning to whatever horrors these masked figures had planned. "How many more prisoners?" Jake asked, helping Sarah drag the unconscious man from his cage while maintaining his watch on the doorways. The man was heavy, dead weight that spoke of deep sedation or worse. "I saw 3 others when they brought me in," Sarah replied, her hands moving efficiently despite their obvious tremor. "A woman named Martha from the Morrison place and 2 men I didn't recognize. They were taking them deeper into the complex toward something they called the observation rooms." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. "They said they were testing the limits of human endurance, studying responses to various stimuli. They talked about us like we were animals, like our suffering was data to be recorded." The clinical detachment she described sent a fresh wave of cold fury through Jake. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic murderers. This was organized, systematic evil driven by curiosity or scientific ambition divorced from any moral consideration. And somewhere in this mountain, more victims were suffering while their captors took notes. Movement in the northern doorway drew Jake's fire, another masked figure retreating hastily as the bullet chipped stone from the wall beside him. The man's voice echoed back through the passage. "You can't win this, cowboy. We have a 12 men, and you have what, 6 shots left? 5? Be reasonable. Let us take the woman and walk away. We'll even let you keep the man in the cage. Fair trade." The offer was absurd, and the casual way it was delivered revealed how little these men valued human life. They saw people as resources to be traded or expended, pieces in a game where only their objectives mattered. Jake didn't bother responding, using the moment of negotiation to scan the chamber for anything that might improve their odds. His eyes fell on the overturned table, where glass beakers had shattered, their contents mixing in puddles on the floor. Chemicals, various colors and viscosities, some of which were beginning to produce smoke as they interacted. The acrid smell that resulted made his eyes water, and an idea began forming, desperate and dangerous, but potentially their only chance. "Sarah," he said quietly, "can you get him to the entrance passage?" "The way I came in?" She assessed the unconscious man, then nodded. "If you can buy me 2 minutes, maybe 3. "Take this." Jake handed her his pistol, a Colt revolver he wore on his hip but rarely used. "If anyone comes at you that isn't me, shoot them. Don't hesitate, don't warn them. Just shoot." Sarah's fingers closed around the grip with the familiarity of someone who had handled firearms before. "I grew up on the frontier, Mr. Hollister. I know how to survive." Jake blinked in surprise. "You know my name?" "Everyone in the valley knows Jake Hollister. the hermit rancher who keeps to himself and wants no part of town politics. A ghost of a smile touched her bruised face. "Guess your isolation just ended." She was right, of course. The moment he had opened that metal door, his quiet life had ended as surely as if he had burned down his own ranch house, but there was no time for regret or reflection. Sarah was already moving, dragging the unconscious man toward the entrance passage with strength born of desperation. And Jake was turning his attention to the chemical supplies scattered throughout the chamber. He didn't know chemistry beyond what any rancher learned through necessity, but he understood fire, understood that some substances burned hotter and faster than others, and that smoke in an enclosed space could be as deadly as bullets. Working quickly, he began gathering the remaining beakers and bottles, reading labels where they existed and making educated guesses where they didn't. Alcohol, ether, compounds with names he didn't recognize, but that smelled volatile enough to serve his purpose. Another voice called from the eastern doorway, different from the first, younger and tinged with uncertainty. "Dr. Callahan says to tell you that cooperation will be rewarded. He's prepared to offer compensation for your silence. $50 in gold for your discretion and immediate departure. Dr. Callahan." A name finally, something concrete, in the fog of masks and anonymity. Jake filed it away while continuing his chemical gathering, creating a pile near the center of the chamber. $50 was a fortune to most cowboys, nearly half a year's wages. That these men could offer it so casually spoke to resources far beyond what simple criminals would possess. "Tell Dr. Callahan," Jake called back, "that he can take his gold and his experiments and go straight to hell." The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from both active doorways, bullets ricocheting off metal equipment and embedding themselves in stone walls. Jake dove behind one of the heavy examination tables, pulling it onto its side to create a barrier. The table was solid metal, thick enough to stop pistol rounds, though he wasn't certain about rifle fire. Glass shattered around him as more chemical containers were hit by stray bullets, adding their volatile contents to the growing pool of flammable liquids spreading across the floor. From his position behind the table, Jake could see Sarah had almost reached the entrance passage, the unconscious man's feet disappearing around the corner. She would make it, he realized. Even if he didn't, Emma would have her mother back, and that was something. More than he had hoped for when he first heard those screams echoing across the mountainside. But Jake Hollister had never been good at accepting noble defeats. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it against his belt buckle, and watched the flame catch and hold. The chemical puddles had spread across a third of the chamber floor, and the ventilation in this underground space was poor. Once fire started, smoke would fill the passages quickly, forcing his enemies to either flee or suffocate. It wasn't a perfect plan, but desperation rarely produced perfection. "Last chance," the voice called from the eastern doorway. "Dr. Callahan is losing patience." Jake looked at the match burning between his fingers, at the spreading chemical pool, at the doorways hiding men who had kidnapped and tortured innocent people in pursuit of knowledge or profit, or whatever twisted motivation drove them. He thought of little Emma waiting by a fire outside, of the 3 prisoners still trapped deeper in this mountain nightmare, of Sarah Garrett's bruised arms and terrified eyes. "Tell Dr. Callahan," Jake said clearly, "that his experiment just failed." He dropped the match. The fire caught faster than he expected, flames racing across the chemical puddles with an eager hunger that seemed almost alive. The heat was immediate and intense, and black smoke began billowing upward almost instantly, seeking outlets through the ventilation shafts and doorways. Shouts of alarm echoed through the complex as the men realized what Jake had done, their voices taking on notes of panic that satisfied something dark in his soul. Jake grabbed his rifle and ran for the entrance passage, keeping low beneath the rapidly accumulating smoke. Behind him, he could hear screaming, some from pain and some from pure terror, as men who had dealt in suffering discovered what it felt like to be on the receiving end. The fire was spreading faster than he had anticipated, feeding on chemicals and wooden structural supports, filling the mountain's belly with cleansing flame. He emerged into the entrance passage to find Sarah waiting, the pistol trained on the doorway with steady hands. The unconscious man lay beside her, still breathing, still surviving against the odds. Together they lifted him, moving as quickly as the burden allowed, toward the distant circle of gray daylight that promised escape and survival, and an end to the nightmare they had endured. The November air hit them like a baptism, cold and clean after the chemical stench of the burning laboratory. Jake and Sarah stumbled through the metal doorway with their unconscious burden, gasping as their lungs expelled smoke and drew in blessed mountain oxygen. Behind them, black smoke was already pouring from the entrance, thick columns rising into the gray sky like a funeral pyre for the evil that had taken root in the mountain's heart. Emma's scream of joy cut through Jake's smoke-induced coughing fit. The little girl came running from her sheltered spot, Jake's coat still wrapped around her small frame, her face transformed from terrified resignation to desperate hope. Sarah dropped to her knees, releasing her hold on the unconscious man, and caught her daughter in an embrace so fierce that Jake had to look away from the intimacy of it. "Mama, Mama, you came back," Emma sobbed, her small hands clutching at her mother's torn dress. "The man promised, but I was so scared you wouldn't." "I know, baby, I know." Sarah's voice broke on the words, her own tears mixing with her daughter's. "But we're safe now. We're going to be okay." Jake wished he could believe that with the same certainty Sarah projected, but his eyes were on the metal door and the passages beyond. The fire he had started was consuming the laboratory. That much was certain from the smoke and the distant sound of collapsing structures. But fire could be escaped, and some of those men might have found other exits. This wasn't over, not by a long measure. "We need to move," he said, hating to interrupt their reunion, but knowing that every second they remained near the facility was a second too many. That fire won't stop all of them, and we're exposed up here. Sarah pulled back from Emma, her mother's eyes assessing her daughter's condition with the swift efficiency of someone trained to spot danger. The blue tinge to Emma's lips, the glassiness of her gaze, the violent shivering that continued despite the coat and blanket wrapped around her. She needs warmth. Real warmth, not just a fire. How far is it to your ranch? 3 hours on horseback, Jake replied, already moving toward Red. But there's a line shack about 40 minutes from here, fully stocked for winter. We can get her warm there and decide our next move. He looked down at the unconscious man they had dragged from the laboratory. In the daylight, Jake could see he was perhaps 25, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors and calluses that suggested manual labor. Not one of the masked experimenters then, but another victim. "Can you ride?" "I grew up on a ranch in Montana," Sarah replied, already lifting Emma while Jake gathered the unconscious man. "I can ride anything with 4 legs and most things with 2. Getting everyone onto Red was a feat of creative horsemanship that tested the patient gelding's tolerance. Jake mounted first. Then Sarah handed up Emma to sit in front of him before climbing up behind with practiced ease. The unconscious man had to be draped across Red's neck, secured with rope from Jake's saddlebags. It was an awkward, ungainly arrangement that would never work for long distances or rough terrain, but for 40 minutes on relatively gentle trails, it would suffice. They had been moving for perhaps 10 minutes when the explosion came. The sound rolled across the mountain like thunder, deep and resonant, followed by a secondary blast that shook the ground beneath Red's hooves. Jake twisted in the saddle to see a massive plume of smoke and debris erupting from the mountainside where the metal door had been. The entrance had collapsed, tons of rock burying whatever remained of the laboratory, and Jake hoped anyone who hadn't managed to escape before the fire reached something truly volatile. What were they doing in there? he asked Sarah, needing to understand the scope of what they had just destroyed. What kind of experiments justify kidnapping people? Sarah's arms tightened around his waist, and when she spoke, her voice carried a hollow quality that spoke of horrors witnessed and barely survived. They were testing pain thresholds, measuring how much suffering the human body could endure before the mind broke completely. They had charts, measurements, notes on everything. How long someone could survive various tortures, what combinations of drugs and physical trauma produced the most interesting results. Dr. Callahan would lecture while his assistants worked, talking about advancing medical science through practical observation. The clinical description made Jake's stomach churn. Medical science? This was torture. They called it research, said that understanding human limits would help doctors treat wounded soldiers better, would advance surgical techniques, would benefit humanity in the long run. Sarah's voice hardened. They said our sacrifice would be remembered as contributing to human knowledge, as if that justified what they did. Emma had gone quiet in front of Jake, listening to her mother's words with the terrible comprehension of a child who had seen too much. He could feel her small body trembling, and not just from the cold. Whatever innocence she had possessed before this morning had been stripped away, replaced by knowledge no child should carry. "How did they take you?" Jake asked, needing the practical details to distract from the horror of the larger picture. "Emma said you were picking berries." "We have a small cabin about 5 miles from town," Sarah explained. "My husband died last year, consumption, and we've been making do on what I can earn taking in laundry and what we can gather from the forest. We were picking the last of the late-season blackberries when they came. 4 men in a wagon, wearing those masks, moving like they had done this many times before. They knew exactly what they were doing, had practiced their approach. One moment we were filling our baskets, the next we had bags over our heads and were being thrown into the wagon. And no one saw anything, no one raised an alarm. Who would see us?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "We live apart from town precisely because I couldn't afford anything closer. The widow Garrett and her daughter, barely making ends meet, too proud to accept charity. We could have disappeared completely and no one would have noticed for days." The words hit Jake with uncomfortable force. He had prided himself on his isolation, on keeping apart from town politics and social obligations. But that isolation had blinded him to suffering happening in his own valley. How many others had vanished before Sarah and Emma? How long had this operation been running while he worked his ranch and congratulated himself on avoiding entanglement with his neighbor's problems? The line shack appeared through the trees, a rough structure that Jake maintained for use during the worst of winter when checking his far fences. It wasn't much, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a stove and wood and supplies that would keep them alive until they could figure out their next move. Jake dismounted carefully, helping Emma down before assisting Sarah. The unconscious man had to be half carried, half dragged inside, but they managed it, laying him on one of the 2 bunks that constituted the shack's sleeping arrangements. While Sarah worked on getting Emma out of her wet clothes and wrapped in dry blankets, Jake built up the fire in the stove until the small space began to warm. He checked their supplies, taking mental inventory. Enough food for 3 days if they were careful, maybe 4. Water from the nearby creek. Medical supplies limited to bandages and whiskey. Not ideal for treating whatever drugs the man had been given, but better than nothing. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, once Emma was settled and beginning to show signs of real warmth returning. "You saved our lives. If you hadn't heard Emma's screams, if you hadn't come, if you hadn't been willing to risk everything for strangers." "We're not strangers anymore," Jake replied, and realized it was true. In the space of a single morning, his carefully maintained isolation had been shattered. He knew Sarah Garrett now, knew her courage and her strength. He knew Emma's resilience. He knew what they had survived, and what they still faced. And this isn't over. You said there were others, 3 more prisoners. Sarah's face fell, guilt and grief warring in her expression. Martha Morrison. I taught her daughter piano before my husband died, and 2 men, minors I think from their hands and the way they talked. The masked men were taking them deeper into the complex when they locked me in that cage. If the fire reached them, if they couldn't escape. She didn't need to finish the thought. The explosion had likely sealed any deeper passages, trapping anyone who hadn't already escaped. If those 3 prisoners had still been alive when Jake dropped his match, they almost certainly weren't now. 3 more deaths to add to the tally. 3 more souls lost to whatever evil Dr. Callahan had been conducting in his mountain laboratory. Jake looked at Emma, finally beginning to sleep in her nest of blankets, and at the unconscious man who might never wake up to explain what had been done to him. He thought of the 3 prisoners possibly dead in the collapsed laboratory, of the masked figures who had escaped and might even now be planning revenge or simply relocating to continue their experiments elsewhere. His quiet life was gone, burned away as surely as the facility in the mountain. But looking at Sarah and Emma, alive when by all rights they should be dead, Jake found he couldn't regret the loss. The unconscious man woke screaming 3 hours after they reached the line shack. His eyes flew open with wild terror, arms flailing as he fought against enemies that existed only in whatever nightmare the drugs had created. Jake had to use his full weight to pin the man to the bunk, while Sarah grabbed his thrashing legs, both of them struggling to keep him from injuring himself or Emma, who had jerked awake with her own cry of fear. "You're safe," Jake repeated over and over, his voice firm but not harsh. "The laboratory is gone. You're safe. We got you out." It took several minutes for the words to penetrate whatever chemical fog clouded the man's mind. Gradually, his struggles weakened, his breathing slowed, and awareness crept back into eyes that had been empty windows into terror. He looked at Jake, then at Sarah, then around the rough interior of the line shack as if trying to reconcile these surroundings with wherever his mind had taken him. "Water," he croaked, his voice raw from screaming, or disuse, or both. Sarah brought him a ladle from the bucket Jake had filled at the creek, supporting his head while he drank with desperate gulps. When he finished, he lay back against the thin pillow, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. But his eyes were clearer now, focused and present in a way they hadn't been before. "My name is Thomas," he said after a moment. "Thomas Brennan. I worked at the Morrison silver mine before." He paused, struggling to organize thoughts that the drugs had scrambled. "How long was I there, in that place?" "How long do you think?" Jake asked gently, understanding that sometimes the only way to assess damage was to measure the gap between perception and reality. "Days? A week, maybe?" Thomas's brow furrowed with concentration. "They kept injecting me with something. I'd wake up and they'd be standing over me with their charts and their needles, asking questions, writing down my answers. Then everything would go gray again and I'd wake up somewhere else or with different people or..." He stopped, his face going pale. "Sometimes I'd wake up and they'd be hurting me, testing to see how I'd react, measuring my screams." Sarah's hand found Jake's, her grip tight with shared horror. Emma had crawled to her mother, pressing close as if proximity could protect her from the memories Thomas's words were awakening. 3 weeks, Jake said quietly. "You disappeared from the Morrison mine 3 weeks ago. The foreman reported it, said you'd gone into town for supplies and never came back. They searched but found nothing." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. 3 weeks? But that's... He couldn't seem to finish the thought, his mind recoiling from the implications of that lost time. 3 weeks of being drugged, questioned, tortured for some purpose he couldn't begin to fathom. 3 weeks of his life stolen by men in masks who saw him as nothing more than a subject for their experiments. "What were they trying to learn?" Jake asked. needing to understand the scope of what they had stumbled into. What kind of information justifies 3 weeks of torture? Thomas shook his head slowly, clearly still struggling to organize memories that the drugs had fragmented. They asked about pain mostly, how it felt, where it started, when it became unbearable. They'd do something, inject something, or cut something, or burn something, and then they'd wait for me to describe it in detail. Doctor Callahan would stand there with his notebook writing everything down, asking follow-up questions like he was conducting a normal medical examination instead of... His voice broke. Instead of what he was actually doing. "Did you see anyone else?" Sarah asked urgently. 3 other prisoners? A woman named Martha and 2 minors? Recognition flared in Thomas's eyes. Martha Morrison, yes. She was in the cage next to mine for a while. They took her away maybe 2 days ago, said something about moving to the next phase of observation. And there was another minor, Jack something. He'd been there longer than me, was barely conscious most of the time. I don't know what they'd done to him, but he looked. Thomas stopped, swallowing hard. He looked like he was dying. The confirmation that the other prisoners had been alive, at least recently, sent a fresh wave of guilt through Jake. If he had acted faster, if he had explored more thoroughly instead of just grabbing Sarah and running, maybe he could have saved them. Maybe Martha Morrison would be here now, instead of trapped in collapsed tunnels or burned in the fire he had started. "It's not your fault," Sarah said quietly, reading the thoughts on his face with the uncanny accuracy of someone who had learned to understand others through shared trauma. "You saved who you could save. No one could have done more." But Jake wasn't certain that was true. A better man, a braver man, might have found a way to rescue everyone. Instead, he had chosen to burn the facility, sealing the fate of anyone who couldn't escape in time. The fact that it had been the only tactical option didn't make the choice any easier to live with. A sound outside the line shack brought all conversation to an abrupt halt. Footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, heavy and deliberate, moving toward the door. Jake grabbed his rifle, which he had propped against the wall, and moved to position himself between the door and the others. Sarah pulled Emma behind her, one hand reaching for the pistol Jake had given her earlier. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A knock, 3 sharp raps echoed through the small space. "Mr. Hollister," a voice called, cultured and educated, carrying the faint accent of someone from the East Coast. "I believe we have matters to discuss. May I come in?" Jake recognized that voice from the laboratory, the one who had offered him $50 in gold to walk away. Dr. Callahan himself, come calling like a neighbor dropping by for Sunday dinner, instead of the architect of nightmares standing outside a mountain-lined shack. "You can go to hell," Jake replied, his rifle trained on the door. "I've got nothing to say to you that this Winchester can't say better. Please, Mr. Hollister, I'm unarmed and alone. I simply wish to speak with you to explain what you interrupted, to help you understand that what you witnessed was part of something larger and more important than you can possibly imagine." The audacity of it was breathtaking. This man had kidnapped and tortured innocent people, had stood by while they suffered for his research, and now he wanted to explain himself as if understanding would somehow justify what he had done, as if the right words could transform evil into something acceptable. "Jake," Sarah whispered urgently, "if he's alone, we could capture him, make him tell us about the others, about whether anyone else escaped, about what this was really about." She was right, of course. Killing Dr. Callahan through the door would be satisfying, but ultimately pointless. They needed information, needed to understand the full scope of the operation they had destroyed. And they needed to know if anyone else had survived, if the 3 prisoners Thomas had mentioned might still be alive somewhere in the mountain's tunnels. "You've got 30 seconds to convince me not to shoot you," Jake called out. "And you better make them count. I'm opening the door now. Dr. Callahan replied, his voice infuriatingly calm. "Please don't do anything rash." The door swung open slowly, revealing a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of face that would have looked distinguished in a university lecture hall. He wore city clothes, now stained with smoke and dirt, and his hands were indeed empty of weapons. But his eyes held a certainty that was somehow more frightening than any gun could have been. This was a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause, who saw his victims as necessary sacrifices to some greater good that only he could perceive. "Thank you for your restraint, Doctor," Callahan said, stepping into the line shack with the confidence of someone entering his own office. His eyes swept the interior, taking in Thomas on the bunk, Sarah and Emma huddled together, Jake with his rifle pointed unwaveringly at the doctor's chest. "I see you managed to save 3 of them. Impressive work, really. Most cowboys would have simply run." "Close the door," Jake ordered, his finger resting lightly on the trigger, "and start talking." Dr. Callahan complied, settling himself on the small bench near the stove with the air of someone preparing to deliver a lecture. "What you destroyed today, Mr. Hollister, was the culmination of 5 years of research into human physiological and psychological responses to extreme stimuli. The work would have revolutionized medical treatment, particularly in the field of battlefield surgery and trauma care. The knowledge we were gathering would have saved thousands of lives. By ending dozens," Sarah said coldly. "By torturing innocent people. By accepting that progress requires sacrifice," Dr. Callahan corrected gently. "Every major medical advance has been built on the suffering of a few for the benefit of many. Anesthesia, antiseptic procedures, even basic surgical techniques were all developed through experimentation that contemporary society would find questionable. I simply had the courage to continue that tradition." Jake stared at this man who could speak of torture and murder with the dispassion of someone discussing crop rotation. "You're insane." Dr. Callahan smiled at Jake's accusation, the expression carrying no warmth or humor. "Insane? No, Mr. Hollister. I'm simply willing to look beyond the comfortable moral boundaries that limit lesser minds. History will vindicate my methods, just as it has vindicated every researcher who dared to push the boundaries of human knowledge." "History will remember you as a monster," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. "As a murderer who hid behind the word science to justify cruelty. Will it?" Dr. Callahan leaned forward slightly, warming to his subject. "Or will it remember me as the man who unlocked the secrets of human endurance, who created protocols that saved countless soldiers from dying of shock on battlefields, who advanced surgical techniques by decades through direct observation of human responses to trauma?" He gestured toward Thomas. "That young man there, for instance, has contributed more to human knowledge in 3 weeks than most people contribute in a lifetime. He should be proud." Thomas lurched up from the bunk, his weakness forgotten in a surge of rage. "Proud? You tortured me. You stole 3 weeks of my life. You made me wish I was dead, and you think I should be proud?" "You survived," Dr. Callahan replied calmly. "That survival, that data on exactly how much the human body can endure before breaking, will help doctors save lives for generations. Your suffering had meaning, purpose. That's more than most people can say about their existence, Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, the temptation to simply end this conversation with a bullet almost overwhelming. But Sarah had been right about needing information, and Dr. Callahan seemed disturbingly willing to talk. "The other prisoners," Jake said, "Martha Morrison and the miners, where are they?" "Ah, yes, I was coming to that." Dr. Callahan's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine regret, though Jake suspected it was more disappointment at lost research than concern for human life. "I'm afraid your dramatic fire complicated matters significantly. The facility had multiple levels, you see. What you burned was merely the intake and preliminary observation area. The deeper chambers, where we conducted the more intensive research, were sealed off when the explosions triggered our emergency protocols. The words sent ice through Jake's veins. They're trapped? Sealed would be more accurate. The emergency system was designed to contain any fires or chemical releases by isolating different sections. Very effective, really. It saved my life and those of 3 of my assistants who were in the lower levels when you decided to play hero. Dr. Callahan's tone carried a hint of reproach, as if Jake had committed a social faux pas rather than destroyed a torture facility. Unfortunately, it also sealed in our remaining subjects. Without external assistance, they have perhaps 48 hours of air. Sarah stood abruptly, her hand clutching the pistol. You're saying they're alive? Trapped, but alive? For now, yes. Though I should mention that Subject 7, the one you know as Martha Morrison, was in the middle of a particularly crucial phase of experimentation when the emergency protocols engaged. She may not survive the full 48 hours given her current condition. The casual way he delivered this information, as if discussing the weather rather than a woman dying slowly in darkness, pushed Jake past the limits of his restraint. He stood and pressed the rifle barrel against Dr. Callahan's forehead. You're going to tell us exactly how to reach them. Every passage, every door, every access point. And if you're lying, if this is some kind of trap, I swear I'll make sure you experience every torture you inflicted on your victims. Dr. Callahan didn't flinch from the gun, his composure unshaken. I have no doubt you would try, Mr. Hollister. But here's the situation as it actually exists. The facility is completely destroyed above ground. The only access to the lower levels requires knowledge of the emergency systems, codes that only I possess. You need me alive and cooperative if you want to save those people. Then cooperate, Jake growled. Oh, I intend to. But I want something in exchange. Doctor? Callahan's eyes moved from Jake to Sarah to Thomas and back again. I want immunity, safe passage out of the territory with my research notes, and a guarantee that no charges will be filed against me. In return, I'll help you rescue the remaining subjects and will cease all operations in this region. The audacity of the proposal left Jake momentarily speechless. This man who had kidnapped and tortured innocent people was negotiating like a businessman discussing contract terms. You think we'd let you walk away? You think there's any universe where you don't hang for what you've done? I think you have approximately 46 hours before 3 people suffocate in darkness, Dr. Callahan replied evenly. I think you're a man who values individual lives over abstract justice, and I think you're smart enough to recognize that saving those 3 people is worth more than the satisfaction of seeing me hang. Sarah moved to stand beside Jake, her face pale but determined. He's right. I hate that he's right, but Martha Morrison has 3 children. She's my friend. If there's any chance we can save her. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood what she was saying. We could force him, Thomas suggested from the bunk, his voice hoarse but growing stronger. Beat the information out of him. You could try, Dr. Callahan agreed pleasantly, but the codes to the emergency systems are complex, and torture tends to make people forgetful. You might get incomplete information, incorrect sequences. The facility has security measures designed to prevent forced access. One wrong code entered, and the whole system locks down permanently, ending any chance of rescue. Jake lowered the rifle slightly, his mind racing through impossible choices. Every instinct screamed against making any deal with this monster. But the image of Martha Morrison trapped in darkness, slowly suffocating while her children waited for a mother who would never return, made the moral clarity he wanted impossible to maintain. Emma, Sarah said quietly, looking down at her daughter who had been listening to the entire exchange with wide, haunted eyes. Cover your ears, sweetheart. Once Emma complied, Sarah turned back to Dr. Callahan. If we agree, how do we know you won't simply kill us once we're in those lower levels? How do we know this isn't a trap to eliminate the witnesses to your crimes? You don't, Dr. Callahan admitted. You have only my word, which I recognize carries little weight given the circumstances. But consider my position rationally. My facility is destroyed, my research subjects are either dead or escaped, and I'm currently outnumbered by armed individuals who would happily see me dead. My only logical play is cooperation, which is precisely what I'm offering. Jake studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw was worse than lies. Dr. Callahan believed every word he was saying. He genuinely saw this as a reasonable negotiation, believed his research justified his methods, and thought immunity was a fair price for saving lives he had endangered in the first place. 2 conditions, Jake said finally, hating himself for even considering the deal. First, you go into those tunnels alone first. Show us you can actually access the systems before we agree to anything. Second, if we do this, if we get those people out alive, you have 12 hours to disappear before I come looking for you. And when I find you, immunity or no immunity, I will kill you. That seems reasonable, Dr. Callahan replied, as if they had just concluded a livestock sale. Though I should mention that the access point to the lower levels is not at the main facility. The emergency protocols would have sealed that entirely. We'll need to use one of the auxiliary entrances. How many entrances does this place have? Sarah asked, suspicion sharp in her voice. 3 main and 5 auxiliary, scattered across the mountain. The nearest is perhaps an hour's ride from here. We should leave soon if we want to maximize our rescue window. Dr. Callahan stood, brushing dirt from his coat as if preparing for a casual outing. I assume someone will stay here with the child? This is no place for someone so young. Jake looked at Emma, still with her hands pressed over her ears, trying to block out the adult conversation that was deciding fates and trading lives like poker chips. Thomas was recovering, but still weak. Sarah had already endured more than any person should have to bear, and Jake himself was the only one who knew these mountains well enough to track Dr. Callahan if he tried to escape. I'll go with him, Jake decided. Sarah, you and Thomas stay here with Emma. If I'm not back in 6 hours, take Red and ride to town. Tell the marshal everything, he'll know what to do. And if it's a trap? Sarah asked. If he leads you into an ambush? Jake met Dr. Callahan's eyes across the small room. Then I'll make sure I take him with me. The auxiliary entrance was not a door, but a well, or at least something that looked like a well from the surface. Dr. Callahan led Jake to it with the confidence of someone following a familiar path, navigating between trees and over rocks that Jake would have sworn showed no signs of regular passage. The structure itself was cunningly disguised, appearing to be nothing more than an abandoned mining claim, complete with a weathered wooden frame and a rusted pulley system that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Impressive camouflage, Jake admitted grudgingly, keeping his rifle pointed at Dr. Callahan's back while scanning the surrounding forest for signs of the ambush he still half expected. How long has this operation been running? In this location? 5 years. Dr. Callahan began removing boards from what looked like a sealed well opening, revealing a metal ladder descending into darkness. Before that, we operated in 3 other territories. We've learned to be mobile, to anticipate when local disappearances might attract unwanted attention, and to relocate before authorities can organize effective investigations. The casual admission sent fresh anger through Jake. 5 years. How many people have you taken? How many died in your experiments? Approximately 40 subjects across all locations, Dr. Callahan replied, as if discussing crop yields. Though died is such an imprecise term, some subjects experienced fatal reactions to certain stimuli, yes. Others simply reached the limits of what their bodies could endure and ceased functioning. The survival rate has been improving as we've refined our techniques. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. Tightened. Every word from this man's mouth made the temptation to simply shoot him and end the conversation almost irresistible. But Martha Morrison and the others were still trapped below, and killing Dr. Callahan would seal their fate as surely as leaving them to suffocate. "You go first," Jake ordered. "And if I see or hear anything that suggests this is a trap, you die before whatever you've planned can happen." Dr. Callahan paused with one foot on the ladder, looking back at Jake with something that might have been curiosity. "You're an interesting man, Mr. Hollister. Most cowboys I've encountered are simple creatures, concerned only with immediate needs and basic survival, but you have depth, complexity. You'd make a fascinating subject for psychological observation. Start climbing before I change my mind about this deal." The descent took longer than Jake expected, the ladder dropping perhaps 60 feet through solid rock before opening into a horizontal passage lit by the same electric bulbs he had seen in the main facility. The air here was cool and dry, carrying the metallic taste of deep earth and something chemical that made Jake's nose wrinkle. Dr. Callahan moved with practiced ease, navigating turns and intersections without hesitation, while Jake followed close enough to shoot, but far enough back to have warning if this turned into a trap. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, they reached a heavy metal door with a complex locking mechanism. Dr. Callahan stopped before it, his hands moving to a panel of numbered buttons that Jake hadn't initially noticed in the dim light. "This is the first security checkpoint. The code sequence is 12 digits, and if any single number is incorrect, the system locks down permanently. Are you quite certain you want me to proceed? Stop stalling and open it." Dr. Callahan's fingers moved across the buttons with the speed of someone who had performed this action hundreds of times. Jake heard mechanical sounds from within the wall, gears turning and bolts sliding. Then the door swung open, revealing another passage beyond, this one better lit and showing signs of regular maintenance. They were inside the intact portions of the facility now, past the collapsed sections that Jake's fire had destroyed. "The observation chambers are 2 levels down," Dr. Callahan explained, moving deeper into the complex. "The emergency protocols would have sealed them individually, creating isolated environments. The subjects inside have limited air, but they also have water and basic supplies. If we're fortunate, all 3 will still be viable for extraction." "Viable," Jake repeated, disgust thick in his voice. "You mean alive. They're people, not inventory." "Semantics, Mr. Hollister. But if it makes you feel better, yes, we're hoping they're still alive." The second security door required an even longer code sequence, and beyond it, Jake could hear something that made his heart clench. Pounding. Someone was hitting metal from the other side, the impacts rhythmic and desperate. Someone was alive in there, aware enough to hear their approach and strong enough to signal for help. Dr. Callahan moved to a third panel, this one beside a viewing window that looked into what he had called an observation chamber. Through the reinforced glass, Jake could see a woman slumped in the corner, her face turned away, but her hands still raised and falling against the metal wall in weak, failing beats. Martha Morrison, almost certainly, using her last strength to call for rescue. "The air in there is nearly depleted," Dr. Callahan observed, checking a gauge beside the window. "Perhaps another hour at most. We should hurry." His fingers moved across the panel, entering what must have been the release code. Jake heard mechanical sounds, but instead of the door opening, red lights began flashing throughout the corridor. An alarm, piercing and insistent, echoed off the stone walls, and Dr. Callahan's expression transformed from professional detachment to something approaching fear. "That's not supposed to happen," he said, his composure finally cracking. "The system should have accepted the code." Something's wrong with the emergency protocols. Jake grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall beside the viewing window. What did you do? Is this your trap? No, no trap, I swear. The system must have been damaged by the explosion. The emergency protocols are malfunctioning. Dr. Callahan's hands scrabbled at the panel, entering code after code while the alarm continued its harsh cry. If I can't override the malfunction, the chambers will remain sealed. The subjects will die, and we'll be trapped down here ourselves when the backup protocols engage. Through the window, Martha Morrison had stopped pounding. Her hand had fallen to her side, and Jake could see her chest moving in shallow, desperate breaths as the last of the oxygen in her sealed chamber ran out. Minutes. She had minutes at most, and the man who held the only key to saving her was frantically pushing buttons while admitting he might not be able to override his own security systems. There has to be a manual release, Jake said, forcing himself to think past his rage and focus on the immediate problem. Emergency systems always have manual overrides in case of power failure. Yes, but the manual controls are inside the chambers themselves. The design prevents unauthorized external access while still allowing subjects to be extracted if primary systems fail. Dr. Callahan's voice was rising now, panic bleeding through his professional demeanor. We'd have to break through the door, which requires tools we don't have, and even then the reinforced construction would take hours to breach. Jake stared through the window at Martha Morrison's failing form and felt the weight of impossible choices crushing down on him. He had come here to rescue trapped prisoners, had made a deal with a monster to save innocent lives, and now he was watching helplessly as the same systems designed to contain and control were ensuring that rescue would come too late. Keep trying the codes, Jake ordered, already moving back down the corridor the way they had come. I'm going back for tools, for help, for anything that might get us through that door faster. You'll never make it in time, Dr. Callahan called after him. Even if you run the entire way, she has perhaps 40 minutes of air left. You can't climb that ladder, ride to your line shack, gather tools, and return before she's dead. Jake knew he was right. The mathematics of time and distance were brutally simple. Martha Morrison was going to die in that sealed chamber, was going to suffocate in darkness while he stood helplessly outside, and there was nothing he could do to change that outcome. Except there was one possibility. Desperate and probably suicidal, but the only option that offered any hope at all. The explosion that sealed these chambers, Jake said, turning back to face Dr. Callahan. What caused it? What was volatile enough to trigger your emergency protocols? Understanding dawned in Dr. Callahan's eyes. The chemical storage in the upper levels. But Mr. Hollister, if you're thinking what I believe you're thinking, the risk of bringing down the entire mountain is substantial. Better to die trying than to stand here watching her suffocate. Jake was already moving, retracing his steps through the passages toward where he knew chemical supplies would be stored in any facility like this. If he could create another explosion, controlled and directed, he might be able to breach the reinforced door, or he might bury them all under tons of rock. But standing still while someone died was not an option he could live with. Jake found the chemical storage room 3 corridors away from the sealed observation chambers, a space lined with shelves holding bottles and containers that bore labels he couldn't read, but that smelled volatile enough to serve his desperate purpose. Dr. Callahan had followed him, no longer maintaining his professional detachment, but moving with the jerky urgency of someone who had finally grasped that his carefully controlled experiment had spiraled beyond his ability to manage. The ether, Dr. Callahan said, pointing to a cluster of brown bottles on the upper shelf. Mixed with the potassium compounds in those jars, it creates a highly unstable reaction. But Mr. Hollister, you must understand that the blast radius in these confined spaces will be unpredictable. You could kill everyone in these chambers, including the woman you're trying to save. Then help me calculate it, Jake replied, already gathering bottles and loading them into a canvas bag he had pulled from a storage cabinet. "You're the scientist. Figure out how much we need to breach that door without bringing down the mountain." For a moment, Dr. Callahan seemed ready to refuse, to retreat into his role as detached observer. Then something shifted in his expression, some recognition of personal stakes in the outcome. If the mountain collapsed, his research notes would be buried, his life's work lost, and his own survival was far from guaranteed in these deep chambers. Self-interest, if not morality, motivated his cooperation. 3 bottles of ether, 2 of the potassium solution, Doctor," Callahan said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone falling back on familiar expertise to manage fear. "We'll need a delayed ignition system. Something that gives us time to retreat but doesn't allow the mixture to separate or dissipate." Jake grabbed a coil of rope from the storage room and a handful of the oil-soaked rags that were used for cleaning equipment. "Will this work for a fuse?" "Crude but functional. The burn rate should give us perhaps 90 seconds before ignition, assuming the rope is properly prepared." Dr. Callahan was already moving, his hands working with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood chemistry at a level Jake could never hope to match. "Help me mix these in the proper ratios. Too much potassium, and the reaction becomes too violent. Too little, and we won't breach the door." They worked together in grim silence, the absurdity of the situation not lost on Jake. He was creating explosives with the man who had tortured his neighbors, cooperating with a monster to save lives that the monster himself had endangered. The moral complexity should have paralyzed him, but there was no time for philosophical wrestling. Martha Morrison was dying, and every second spent in contemplation was a second closer to her last breath. The improvised bomb, if it could be called that, consisted of 5 bottles arranged in a canvas bag, with the chemical mixture pooled at the bottom and the rope fuse extending from the top. It looked like something a child might construct, crude and uncertain, but Dr. Callahan nodded with what appeared to be professional approval. "Position it against the door's hinges," he instructed as they hurried back to the sealed observation chamber. "The reinforcement is weakest there, and the blast should propagate along the seams rather than simply reflecting back at us." Through the viewing window, Martha Morrison was no longer moving. Her chest still rose and fell, but barely, the movement so shallow that Jake had to press his face against the glass to confirm she was still breathing. The air gauge beside the window showed red across every indicator. She had minutes, possibly less. Jake positioned the bomb exactly where Dr. Callahan indicated, wedging it against the door's frame and ensuring the bottles were stable. His hands were steady despite the thunder of his heartbeat. There was no room for error here, no second chances if the mixture failed or if the explosion proved too powerful. This was the moment that would define whether his intervention had saved lives or simply added more deaths to the tally he would carry for the rest of his days. "Light the fuse and run," Dr. Callahan said unnecessarily. "The corridor turns 30 feet back. That should provide adequate protection from the initial blast, though the concussion wave may still be substantial." Jake struck a match against his belt buckle, watched it flare to life, and touched the flame to the oil-soaked rope. The fire caught immediately, racing up the improvised fuse faster than he had expected. He turned and ran, Dr. Callahan already ahead of him, both men sprinting for the corner that represented safety or at least survival. They had just reached the turn when the explosion came. The sound was beyond anything Jake had experienced, a physical force that lifted him off his feet and slammed him against the stone wall. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that blocked out all other noise. Dust and debris filled the corridor, reducing visibility to nothing, and for a terrible moment he thought they had brought down the mountain after all, that the explosion had triggered a collapse that would bury them all in darkness. But gradually the dust settled. The ringing in his ears faded enough to hear other sounds, and Jake realized he was still alive and the ceiling above him was intact. He pulled himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact but nothing broken or bleeding seriously. Dr. Callahan was already up, moving back toward where the observation chamber had been, and Jake followed on unsteady legs. The door was gone. Not just opened but obliterated. The reinforced metal twisted and torn like paper in a storm. The explosion had done exactly what they needed, breaching the chamber while directing most of the force outward rather than into the small space where Martha Morrison lay. Jake stumbled through the smoking ruins of the doorway and found her still in the corner, unconscious but breathing, her chest rising and falling with the deep gulps of someone whose body was desperately processing the sudden influx of oxygen. "She's alive, Doctor," Callahan said, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the doctor's voice carried something that sounded like genuine emotion. Not quite relief, but perhaps surprise that his calculations had proven accurate. "Help me move her. We need to check the other chambers." They worked together to lift Martha's limp form, carrying her back through the corridors to where cleaner air flowed from the surface access. Jake could feel her pulse under his fingers, weak but steady, and allowed himself a moment of hope that perhaps this desperate gamble had worked after all. The second observation chamber required another explosion, though this time Jake knew what to expect and prepared accordingly. The process was quicker, more confident, and when the door blew apart, they found one of the missing miners inside, alive but barely conscious from oxygen deprivation. Dr. Callahan administered something from a medical kit he carried, a stimulant that brought the man's breathing back to something approaching normal. "The third chamber," Jake said urgently. "Where is it?" "One level down," Dr. Callahan replied, already moving toward a stairwell that descended into deeper darkness. "But Mr. Hollister, I must warn you that Subject 9, the last miner, was in critical condition even before the emergency protocols engaged. The likelihood that he survived this long is minimal. We check anyway." The third chamber was different from the others, smaller and equipped with medical apparatus that suggested it had served purposes beyond simple observation. The man inside was indeed in critical condition, his breathing so shallow as to be almost undetectable, his skin gray with the pallor of someone at death's threshold. But his eyes were open when Jake and Dr. Callahan breached the door, and in those eyes Jake saw recognition, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Jack," Dr. Callahan said quietly, kneeling beside the dying man, "I didn't expect you to have survived this long. Your resilience has been remarkable." The miner's hand moved, weak and trembling, and grasped Dr. Callahan's wrist with what little strength remained. His lips moved, forming words that Jake had to lean close to hear over the still ringing aftermath of the explosion. "Why?" the miner whispered. "Why did you do this to us?" Dr. Callahan was silent for a long moment, staring at the hand clutching his wrist, at the man he had systematically destroyed in pursuit of knowledge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier certainty. "Because I believed the ends justified the means. Because I convinced myself that individual suffering was acceptable when balanced against collective benefit. Because I stopped seeing you as people and started seeing you only as data." He paused, seeming to struggle with words he had perhaps never spoken before. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like smoke from the explosions, carrying weight that seemed to press down on all three men in that small chamber. Jack the miner stared at Dr. Callahan, with eyes that had seen too much suffering to process this unexpected confession. His grip on the doctor's wrist loosened, strength failing, and Jake moved quickly to check his pulse. Faint but present, fighting to continue despite everything his body had endured. "Help me get him upstairs," Jake said. "He needs real air and real medical care, not whatever you were planning to do with him." Dr. Callahan nodded, and together they lifted the barely conscious miner, navigating the damaged corridors and stairwells back toward the surface access. The journey took nearly an hour, complicated by their human burdens and the unstable condition of passages that had been shaken by multiple explosions. Twice they had to backtrack when they found their path blocked by collapsed sections, and once Jake thought they heard voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the mountain complex, though whether they belonged to Dr. Callahan's escaped assistants or were simply acoustical tricks of the damaged facility, he couldn't determine. By the time they emerged from the well entrance, the November sun was already beginning its descent toward evening, and Jake realized with shock that an entire day had passed since he first heard Emma's screams echoing across the mountainside. It felt like a lifetime compressed into hours, a fundamental transformation of who he was and what he believed possible in a world he had thought he understood. Sarah and Thomas were waiting at the line shack when Jake and Dr. Callahan arrived with their rescued burdens. Emma ran to her mother when she saw Martha Morrison's unconscious form, tears streaming down her face, while Thomas helped carry the two miners inside, where the fire still burned in the stove. The small space was crowded now, 5 adults and 1 child pressed into quarters meant for solitary refuge, but no one complained about the proximity. They were alive, all of them, against odds that should have been insurmountable. "She's breathing easier now," Sarah reported after examining Martha. "Whatever you did down there, however you got her out, you saved her life." Jake looked at Dr. Callahan, who stood apart from the others near the door, his earlier confidence replaced by something that might have been uncertainty or possibly the first stirrings of genuine remorse. "We both did," Jake admitted, knowing the words would complicate the simple narrative of heroes and villains that everyone wanted to believe. "Without his knowledge, I never would have breached those chambers in time. That doesn't absolve him," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks of torture. "He created the situation that required saving in the first place." "No, it doesn't absolve him," Jake agreed, "but it complicates things." Dr. Callahan cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I made you a promise, Mr. Hollister. 12 hours to disappear before you came looking for me. I intend to honor that agreement, but I wanted to say something first." He paused, seeming to gather thoughts that had never been organized for public expression. "What I did in that facility, what I justified as research and advancement of human knowledge, was evil. Not misguided or ethically complex or morally ambiguous, just evil. No amount of potential benefit can justify the suffering I inflicted, and no historical vindication would make it acceptable." Sarah stood, her hand instinctively moving to Emma's shoulder. "Why now? Why this sudden moral awakening after 5 years of torture?" "Because watching you risk everything to save strangers, watching Mr. Hollister make a deal with his enemy to rescue people he didn't know, forced me to see what I had become. I've spent years convincing myself that I was different from my subjects, that my education and purpose elevated me beyond normal moral considerations. But you showed me that the difference between us isn't intelligence or vision or scientific detachment. It's simply that you chose to see people as people, while I chose to see them as data." Dr. Callahan's voice cracked slightly. "That choice is what made me a monster." The silence that followed his confession was broken only by the crackling of the fire and Martha Morrison's labored breathing. Jake found himself in the impossible position of partially understanding, even partially sympathizing with, a man who absolutely deserved punishment for his crimes. The complexity of it exhausted him in ways the physical ordeal had not. "The territorial marshal needs to know everything," Jake said finally. "About the facility, about the experiments, about the other victims you mentioned. 40 people across 5 years, you said. Their families deserve answers." "I'll provide full documentation," Dr. Callahan replied. "Everything I know about every subject, every location, every person involved in the operation. It won't undo the harm, but it might bring some closure to those who lost loved ones." "And you?" Sarah asked. "What happens to you?" Dr. Callahan pulled a pistol from inside his coat, and for a moment Jake's hand moved toward his rifle, before he realized the doctor wasn't pointing the weapon at anyone. "I made another promise today, though not to you. I promised Jack down in that chamber that I would make amends, that I would ensure my research could never harm anyone else." He looked at each of them in turn, his expression carrying something that might have been peace. Some debts can't be paid through documentation and cooperation. The single gunshot echoed across the mountain, causing birds to scatter from nearby trees and Emma to cry out in fear. Dr. Callahan fell backward through the open door, landing in the dirt outside the line shack, the pistol still clutched in his hand. Sarah shielded Emma from the sight while Thomas moved to check for signs of life, though everyone knew what he would find. "He's dead," Thomas confirmed quietly. "Chose his own judgment rather than waiting for the courts." Jake stepped outside, looking down at the body of a man who had been brilliant and evil and ultimately perhaps capable of recognizing the difference. The moral complexity of feeling anything other than satisfaction at his death troubled Jake. But he had learned today that simple narratives were luxuries the real world rarely offered. They buried Dr. Callahan in a shallow grave marked only by stones, deep enough to prevent scavengers but not so deep as to suggest honor. His research notes, which he had carried in a leather satchel, would go to the territorial marshal, along with Jake's full accounting of everything that had happened. 40 families would finally learn the fates of their missing loved ones, and the other assistants who had escaped would eventually be tracked down and brought to justice. Martha Morrison woke 3 days later in the doctor's office in Pinewood, confused and traumatized but alive. The 2 miners recovered more slowly, their bodies and minds bearing scars that would never fully heal. But they were alive, saved by a cowboy who had heard screams and chosen to investigate rather than ride away. Jake Hollister's quiet life ended that November morning on the mountain, replaced by something more complicated and infinitely more connected to the community he had tried so hard to avoid. Sarah and Emma became regular visitors to his ranch, helping him manage the property while Sarah recovered from her ordeal. Thomas, once he regained his strength, took a job as Jake's hired hand, finding it easier to face his demons when surrounded by people who understood what he had survived. The mountain kept its secrets about exactly how many had died in Dr. Callahan's experiments before Jake's intervention. Some questions would never be answered, but the screaming had stopped. The evil that had taken root in the stone chambers had been burned away, and the valley was healing one day at a time. Jake stood on his porch 6 months later, watching Emma chase butterflies through the wild flowers that had bloomed early that spring. Sarah was inside making dinner, and Thomas was working the north fence where the property bordered the mountain. It was domestic and normal, and nothing like the isolation Jake had once convinced himself he wanted, and he had never been happier.